period that I was kind of worried for a minute what Chris was going to say about it, but that's all right. Yeah, Chris is a student that filled in. I'm sorry I let him graduate, right? I got a lot of good archaeology done with Chris was my student here. But North Carolina's lost is South Carolina's gain in that regard. So this evening, what I want to do is talk about my favorite archaeological periods, the Paleoindian period and the Early Archaic period. But I'm doing that with an eye towards the Carolinas, right? North and South Carolina have their story to tell about the earliest peoples here in the southeastern U.S. And I think we have something unique and original to provide in that regard. So let me give you a brief overview of what we're going to do. I'm going to give you, you got to have context, right? And so I'm going to provide the context in terms of talking about time, chronology, some typology, artifact typologies. How do we recognize the Paleoindian Early Archaic period? And a little bit about the environment. The environment is critical in my mind because the earliest people here in the Carolinas encountered an environment that is very different than the one we live in today. And then I'm going to highlight some new data, some new information that's coming out of primarily North Carolina with regard to the Paleoindian and Early Archaic periods. And then I'll kind of wrap it up by talking a little bit about the future. There's some interesting new methodological studies that are being done, right? That we didn't conceive of just even a couple of decades ago. All right, so that's kind of our roadmap, right? So I've been charged with talking about the Paleoindian period, right? And that period corresponds with the evidence of the earliest people here in North America. Primarily, this is referred to as the Clovis point, Clovis people. I'll talk about that in a second. But inevitably, that begs the question about the origins of Clovis. I'm not going to go there. That's another lecture, right? I'll have to take my North American archaeology class in the fall, right? All will sign up for that, right? And where I talk about sort of pre-Clovis and all. But for our purposes, we're going to stipulate that Clovis is the first widely recognized archaeological culture that existed in the southeast, really all across North America. And that's illustrated by this map here. Make sure I press the right button. And see these little orange dots here, various sized dots. That represents one or more fluted points. Primarily, this is a Clovis point, but there's some post-Clovis fluted points here. This is a map from my colleague David Anderson at the University of Tennessee, and his colleagues put together this huge database. It's a monumental piece of work that records the presence of all known fluted points all across North America. Right? This is the data point here is roughly 13,000 years ago at Clovis times. You can see these sort of ice sheets, the two ice sheets here, and then the ice street corridor that sort of is considered by some as being a primary entryway into the lower 48, into sort of North America. But I'll just say one thing. What's interesting about this map here is one pattern that jumps out at you is that the density of Clovis points east of the Mississippi is much greater than those to the west, right? The Rocky Mountains and the Great Plains and all the way to the Pacific coast, right? And what does that mean? One thing is that keep in mind that most of these points here east of the Mississippi, those are surface finds. Collectors, right? Collectors, I'm a big advocate of working with collectors. There's a chapter on that in my book, right? And so this is interesting in that the vast majority of these points are from surface collection east of the Mississippi. West, those those are really true bona fide sites where there's excavated context where a point is associated with a whole assemblage of materials, right? That's sort of interesting to think about in terms of the context of interpreting this, and I'll return to that towards the end here. All right, environment. The other context here is environment. So the Paleoindian period is present at the end of the geological period, epoch actually, the geological epoch that's known as the Pleistocene, or the Great Ice Age. Right? And so the people that lived in the Carolinas, in fact all over North America, at the end of the Pleistocene, lived in conditions very different from today. If you were transported back in time in the Carolinas 10 to 13,000 years ago, you would probably have this sort of ambivalence. You would look at the landscape and see something familiar, but something also eerily different about it. Perhaps the first thing that would jump out at you is the different species of animals that were present. And this, of course, is well known, the mammoth and mastodon. These are sort of mastodons. There's long-horned bison, the saber cats. This is a short-faced bear, right? It's a species of bear that is obviously, we have the black bear here in the southeast. This is an ancestor of that. So many of these animals, of course, went extinct. These elephants, right? These mastodon and mammoths are no longer native to North America. So you would recognize those, but then you would say, well, wait a minute, they ain't from around here, right? And so these are all species of animals and plant communities. We call this non-analogous. That's a jargon that means you can't look anywhere in North America and find any kind of community of plant and animal communities that's comparable to what existed in the past. You can recognize certain animals and plants, but the communities of those look, in terms of their, the community is not seen today. And in terms of the environment, in terms of, call it the Ice Age, right? But really, the temperatures were cooler than today. There was less rainfall today, but probably the mean annual temperature across the globe around 10 to 13,000 years ago was in the mid-40s. Now, the closer you move towards the glaciers, the cooler it is, but the mid-40s, that's not too bad. But here's some context for you. The mean annual temperature of the 20th century was 57 degrees. And so there's about a 10-degree difference in terms of, and that's a big difference, but the point is, it's not, they didn't have to wear parkas and live like Eskimos, particularly here in the temperate southeast. In the temperate southeast, an area from the Cape Fear River down to about Charleston. Its temperate conditions would have had communities of species of hardwoods, mixed hardwoods, some boreal kind of evergreens, right, that you don't see down here today. We think of evergreens as being the New England postcard kind of thing. And very few pine trees. Right? Very few pine trees. Pine trees are only a product of the last 5,000 years when the Ice Age began to dissipate, right? We get sort of modern climate conditions. So the point is, there would be an environment in terms of plant and animals that are unlike anything that exists today. This was the context in which these earliest people lived. So why the environment was important? Well, the plants and animals, that's the subsistence, right? These were hunter-gatherer folks. This is long before agriculture, right? Long before agriculture. So these people lived by hunting and gathering. They hunted animals, gathered wild plants, and so that was critical to their survival. Another resource critical to their survival was stone. Right? So, now they didn't eat stone, but they certainly consumed it because they needed it to make these tools and weapons that was necessary to procure the plants and animals they ate, right? And in North Carolina, not all stone was usable in terms of making a projectile point or a scraper, or whatever sort of stone tool you want. Not all stone was created equal with respect to its ability to be used as a resource, right? All stone is hard. I mean, if you want to chop down a tree or kill an animal, you need something hard. All stone is hard in that regard. But what makes a stone useful is the property geologists call conchoidal fracture. And what does that mean? Conchoidal means shell-like. And what that means, if you know where to hit a stone, the angle and how hard to hit a stone, you can remove flakes, right? It's like whittling a piece of wood to the desired product. Well, instead of whittling with carving, they're banging rocks together, right? And that's real skill, right? Anybody who's seen sort of flint hammers work, it's really an acquired skill. So, not a stone that's useful to be made into a projectile point, a spear point, doesn't occur everywhere on the landscape. Right? It's only a few places. In North Carolina, the stone, the righteous rock of North Carolina is a stone generically called Rhyolite. Where is that found? It's found in the sort of Piedmont here, all along the eastern edge of the Piedmont, and particularly it's the Uwharrie Mountains in Stanley and Montgomery counties. It's a sort of intermittent chain of mountains, about 20-25 miles in length. It crosses the Yadkin, Pee Dee, and runs up the Uwharrie River. It's the Uwharrie Mountains, right? All of these mountains are capped with this metavolcanic stone. Rhyolite is the generic term. Geologists kind of created, well, not all of that stone is rhyolite, man. But it's a metamorphosed volcanic stone. Right? Volcanic is key here, right? Its origins is volcanic, not unlike obsidian, which most people, the glassy volcanic rock, right? Rhyolite metamorphic is chemically very similar to obsidian. So rhyolite is the eastern equivalent of obsidian. The difference is it was not cooled as quickly as obsidian. The lava flows and became obsidian, it was cooled rather rapidly. That's not the case with the rhyolite. That rhyolite has its origins as being a volcanic rock, being then metamorphosed, hence the meta in front of volcanic. And that helped, the low-grade metamorphism helped create the conchoidal fracture that makes sort of rhyolite. And so all these mountains here, you see the white, this is a LiDAR image, right? LiDAR thing of an aerial photograph. And these white here is the high elevation, so the white that you see here, that's the highest elevations. And virtually every mountaintop in the Uwharrie Mountains is capped with rhyolite, and virtually every one of those is a prehistoric quarry. Right? When I was in Chapel Hill, part of my dissertation research was mapping the rhyolite in the Uwharrie Mountains and documenting the quarries. Why is that important? Well, the Hardaway site, which I think many of you are familiar with, is right here, right? It's no accident that the Hardaway site is within the shadow of the Uwharrie Mountains. Right? I'll say more about that in a minute. They were there because of the Uwharrie Mountains. And so one of these, there's various types, various flavors of rhyolite. Right? I won't go into that. You can read about that in my book. Did I mention that in the book? Yeah. I'm sorry. I'm shaking. Right? And so the one quarry that stands out among all of these is Morrow Mountain. That little blip right there, this is from the Yadkin River looking across. Morrow Mountain is Morrow Mountain State Park. Morrow Mountain State Park is the Uwharrie National Forest. I love this site. They had many uses. Well, the use that was most important to the first people was the stone there. And Morrow Mountain is the most spectacular quarry in North Carolina, one of the most spectacular in the Southeast, if you ask me. It is, spring is here, summer's around the corner. Do yourself a favor, take a trip up to Morrow Mountain. You will not be disappointed. You can drive up to and park at the top of Morrow Mountain. There's picnic tables. There's a wonderful viewing spot. What most people don't realize, though, is they're walking from the parking lot to the picnic tables. They're stepping on prehistoric quarry debris. You cannot put a footstep on Morrow Mountain without stepping on artifacts. Right? And all this is quarry debris. There was probably an Indian on Mar Mountain every day for 10,000 years. It's just, it's incredible. And you can look at this, see, I don't know if you can see all that gray there, right? That's, this is an erosional ditch on the southeast corner of Mar Mountain, 9-10 feet deep, and it's just littered. There's more stone than dirt here, right? And this is all the result of getting the bedrock. There was probably some boulders at one point at the surface, and they beat the hell out of it, beat it all the way down, and then had to start digging to get the stone out. And so this is the late Bob Butler. He was, when I was doing my dissertation research, I'm an archaeologist, not a geologist, so I was fortunate to work with Bob Butler, who's did some of the original mapping of the geology awards. He had sort of a tangential interest in archaeology. And so he and I spent a couple of winters surveying the warring mountains. And he ended up petrologically characterizing sort of all the rhyolite. He's a hard rock geologist. And when I found out that as we were driving around back and forth from Chapel Hill to the warring mountains, hard rock characterizes his geological interest, but when he came to radio stations, hard rock didn't work for him, all right? So, what are we talking about time-wise? Well, the Paleoindian period, I kind of begin the Paleoindian in Clovis around 1305. I'll note that that may be a few centuries too early for some archaeologists. Waters and Stafford have published an article just a couple of years ago where they went back and redated a handful of Clovis sites. They come, I prescribe to a long chronology. They have more of a short chronology, but they did a really fine-tuned and they rejected some sites and looked at others. And so the point is they only have a sample size of 10 sites, right? And that's what this map represents. Here's the sites. This is time, and these bars represent length. And so this brown area represents what they call the short chronology. And so Clovis, according to them, only dates from about 1301 to 1208. That's only a few centuries, the short chronology. Right? I bump it up a few hundred years earlier because you may not have dated the earliest Clovis site there is. And one other thing I'll notice, these are the sites, there's more than 10 sites here. This is where they discuss the reasons why they accepted some sites and rejected others. But I'll point out, look at this sort of bar in the eastern woodlands. Look at the number of sites from the east that they dated. You know, you can count on one hand. So the point is, we need more good in-place Clovis sites to really get a handle on the Clovis chronology. I think now you can put copper in here, right? Familiar with Al Goodyear and the copper site from South Carolina. That falls within a good Clovis range. All right, so what's the Clovis point? Well, the Clovis point is the archaeological manifestation of the early part of the Paleoindian period. Is this classic lancelet-shaped point. It has a slight basal concavity, ground and lateral edges, and the characteristic flute, that channel which occurs from the base up till, it depends upon how long the blade is, what's left of the blade, 25%, 30% of the blade. And these are Clovis points from the southwest where Clovis was defined from Clovis, New Mexico. These are from Clovis, New Mexico. There's a type site, Blackwater Draw, and those other type sites. But here in the east and in the Carolinas, we have fluted points that are dead ringers for any kind of Clovis point. Right? The only difference is raw material work. These points are made of chert and obsidian. In North Carolina, we've got most of these meta-volcanic points and some chert points. I'll return to that. But they're roughly, you know, here's some just basic dimensions here, 60 millimeters, about 2.5 inches long. Although we have some outliers that are much longer, and I don't like the relatively short points here, but these long Clovis point in the southwest. And so we have what anybody I think that by any definition of Clovis point, right, we have those here in the Carolinas as well. Well, in North Carolina, we don't have any in situ Clovis sites in North Carolina, unfortunately. But we do have one Clovis assemblage that came from a surface collection of the Pascagoula sites, primarily the result of one collector, Jim Pritchard, who collected the Pascagoula in the northeastern part of the state, Pascagoula County, along the Pascagoula River. This property that he collected for years, several hundred artifacts that included 3 fluting points, right, and a number of beautification tools, and he even collected flakes. So this is important here that he collected everything. And there's some archaic points in here too. It's not unusual in the field to find points of various periods. But there were a number of beautification tools, a total of about 400 tools and flakes in all, that are recognizable as Paleoindian in morphology. So you have these end scrapers, side scrapers, but what ties them all together is a particular kind of raw material. This green, highly siliceous material, it may be what's called a rhyolite tuff. We haven't pinpointed the location of that, but the important point here is that this one fluted point, the base here, this broken fluted point, and then these other scrapers and flakes, all of that same material. So by association here, fluted point and all these other points made the same material, I assume it's part of the same assemblage, right? And so this is a nice Clovis system. It's the only documented one we have in North Carolina. This was a thesis from one of my graduate students several years ago. So where's the source of the stone? I'm not quite sure. But wherever it is, it ain't in the coastal plain, because we don't have that kind of stone naturally occurring in the coastal plain of North Carolina. It probably came from up north, either in Virginia. There's McAvoy's talk about the Bolster store has stone that sort of resemble this, or it could come from here's Bolster's store right up here near the famous Williamson site, Williamson Church, or along the eastern edge of the Piedmont. It couldn't come as far away as the Warring Mountains. We're talking about over 200 miles, right? Minimum of about 90 miles to 200 miles. Wherever that stone came from, right, wherever that toolkit originated, it was transported some distance to end up being discarded there in the field of Pascagoula County. And so, what do we make of this? Well, what seems clear to me is that this is a tool. This is a mobile hunter-gatherer toolkit. Right? There's not any kind of stone acquisition going on here. Rather, we see evidence of tool maintenance, tool refurbishing, the sharpening of tools, and use of tools probably at the site, and tool recycling. So this is probably one brief stop in some kind of annual movement that the band, the group, that whoever ended up sort of starting the tools there, incorporated an annual round that moved somewhere into the Piedmont to get that stone, and then closer to the coastal plain, into the coastal plain later in the year. So, in the absence of a bona fide Clovis site, our best strategy for understanding Paleoindian period in North Carolina is looking at the distribution of the Clovis points. This involves sort of reaching out to collectors, to look at museums, and documenting the statewide distribution of Clovis points. I've been doing that now for a couple of decades. And this is a distribution map. This is actually 2 or 3 years old. But this represents sort of 229 Clovis points. Today, And even as we speak, we're up to 270. And so I published on this over the years, and I'm working on an update here. Hopefully this summer the manuscript will be finished. I'm collaborating with Al Goodyear, Chris Moore, and Joe Wilkinson, my South Carolina colleagues. I'm trying to get the big picture here with respect to sort of fluted points in the Carolinas, right? So stay tuned. But this map here shows the distribution of Clovis points. And this kind of bar here, I know you can't really read it from where you're at, but just know that green is 0 to low, 0 or 1 point. These are points per county, right? We're using county as kind of a convenience here, although we have pinpoint locations in some points, we only have county and others. And then the light colored, I don't know what color these are, pink or red or white. And so what you see here is that the greatest density of points, perhaps not surprisingly, is in the Piedmont, eastern Piedmont. We have sub-points, interesting, these kind of fingers into the coastal plain. These tend to follow some of the major river drainages that have this southeastern sort of orientation out to the Atlantic. So it may be the case that sort of the Clovis concentration, remember these are some of the first peoples into the North Carolina, concentrated in the Piedmont and then spent part of their annual around moving into the coastal plain and then back up into the Piedmont at other times of the year. So otherwise, the coastal plain is kind of absent, have very low frequencies of these Clovis points. This parallels the low frequency of Clovis points to the western Piedmont. You don't get any, the densities start to pick up right here in the Appalachians and the mountains, but I think this concentration is more closely related to Tennessee. You get a lot of other points in Tennessee. So we've got this sort of real concentration right here toward the eastern Piedmont. One other thing that comes out of studying this is the raw material that's used to make these points. And it's illustrated in this table here. Now I've lumped here raw material types. You've got to pull out signal versus the noise here. And by lumping, this is a variety of metamorphic point types. There's a variety of chert types. But even lumping that at this sort of gross level of metamorphic and chert, I think it's meaningful. And so what you see here is roughly 50% of the Clovis points in North Carolina made of metamorphic stone, roughly 30 made of chert, and then other, that includes quartz, quartzite, quartzite, that sort of material. This 30% of chert, that's really interesting. Why? Because chert doesn't occur in North Carolina. If you find a chert point in North Carolina, that ain't from around North Carolina, right? I say that ain't from around. And so that's a significantly high frequency of points. In fact, once you get out of the Paleoindian period, you don't see a chert point in North Carolina. I mean, it's very low frequency. In fact, by Dalton times, that frequency plummets to less than 1%. Right? So what does this mean? Well, I think if these chert points, I think these are chert points that originated outside North Carolina, and in fact, chert Clovis points may represent some of the earliest movement of people from outside North Carolina into North Carolina. This is the archaeological signature of the first North Carolinians. So, the statewide, you need to get a big picture perspective here. That's why the statewide surveys are important. But you need more than one state here to get the real picture, because state boundaries don't mean anything to, obviously, the Paleoindians, right? And so that's why I've been working with Al Goodyear and Chris Moore here in South Carolina, syncing our databases, right, so to speak. And an interesting thing we find out here is that extension, that concentration of metavolcanic points that are concentrated here in the Carolinas extends down into South Carolina. And this is illustrated here. This is Al's This is Clovis points. Each one of these represents a Clovis point, a metavolcanic Clovis point in the northern part of the state, and then, of course, all these chert points, probably the Alluvial chert. We've got the coastal plain, the Alluvial chert points along the Savannah River, and then the northern part, the watery, santee rivers. I think that's a real boundary. You get very few metavolcanic points. Look at those, 1, 2, 3. You can count those in your hand that extend down into watery sandy. That's a real boundary. And I think what Al and I have talked about is a stone as being sort of a signature of sort of the various overlapping band ranges. And so Al calls me a member of the Uwharrie band, and he's a member of the Allendale band, right? And so I think these are interesting signatures that represent ranges, homeland, territories, for the lack of a better word, of different groups in the Carolinas 10 to 13,000 years ago. Right. One other thing is, as a total aside here, I don't know who created this boundary here between North and South Carolina, but they screwed up. Right? They should have used the watery Santee River as the boundary, because I'm from North Carolina. I want my Rhyolite Clovis points back, right? And so this should all be North Carolina, right? So Clovis aren't the only fluted points, and we get other fluted points. Redstone. These are redstone points, and then of course hardwood dogs. These are images. They're black and white images in my book, but there's a link in my book that you can get these high-resolution color images available from my book as well. Did I mention that? All right. So there are other fluted points that almost certainly postdates Clovis. Again, we don't have any dates. We don't have any kind of strategic sites that underwrite the sequence. But clearly, Dalton points have to postdate Clovis. But I think there's an interesting transitional point called Redstone that provides a transitional bridge between Clovis and Hardaway Dalton. So these redstone points here, they have flutes like Clovis points. In fact, some of the flutes are deeper and longer in redstone than they are in Clovis. But they have a much deeper concave base with a greater ears on them than Clovis points. Ears reminiscence of the Hardaway Dalton, right? I think that presages Hardaway Dalton with a deep concavity in the ears, which become more fully developed here in Hardaway Dalton. Some Hardaway points are fluted, but many aren't. There may be some, Bruce Bradley talks about the difference between morphological fluting and technological fluting. I'll get into that maybe later. But I think if you're looking for sort of evolutionary sequences here, not to put too fine a point on it, but I think there's ancestral descendant relationships and point traditions that I talk about in my book, manufacturing traditions that have a long legacy in terms of from the Paleoindian period. So Clovis, Redstone, Hardaway Dalton. All right, so at the tail end of the Hardaway Dalton represents the tail end of the Paleoindian. In some cases, it can be referred to as early archaic. You know, I don't get too hung up on that. I use those terms interchangeably because it depends upon how you define Paleoindian. If you define Paleoindian as hunting sort of big game and ice age, well then Hardaway Dalton postdates that, and it's not Paleoindian. But if you define Paleoindian as being fluted, then some flute points fall in that tradition. So I use the term interchangeably. I'm not being wishy-washy. It just depends upon the criteria you use to place points in various time periods. So the Hardaway point obviously comes from the Hardaway site, right? Another point. The Hardaway site is known for the work of Geoffrey Coe, a seminal foundational work for basically any archaeologist who works in the Southeast, doing the Eastern Woodland. His work at the Hardaway site, Hardaway, Dorset, and Louder's Ferry, all along the had been in the Roanoke Rivers, right? The Hardaway, Georgia, the Roberts Ferry, the Holy Trinity in North Carolina Archaeology, right? They established that. So, working in typology and chronology, my dissertation research was re-looking at some of the material at Hardaway site that never was analyzed. But I kind of followed up taking a different track, looking at what was the function of the Hardaway site. Right? There's certainly implications that's in Poe's work about that, but he never explicitly addressed that. So I looked and did an analysis of a sample of the assemblage with an eye towards looking at what tools were there and what possible tasks they could be used for. Long story short, I came away with the idea that Hardaway functioned as a quarry-related base camp. Right? It's no accident that Hardaway's in the shadow of the Warren Mountains. All the stone in the Hardaway site came from either Morrow Mountain or somewhere in the Warren Mountains. They were sitting there, returning to the Warrens to gear up, right? When you run out of gas, where do you go? You got to go to the gas station. When your toolkits run out of stone, where do you got to go? You got to go to the quarry, right? And again, if you were an Indian living in North Carolina 2,000 years ago, you knew where Morrow Mountain is. You knew where the Warren Mountain is. So that's the place where they return to time and again to gear up for their tools. So Hardaway's right here. And I'll just note, I'll get to this in a minute, the cold site, right, down in the Pee Dee. The advocate comes to the Pee Dee, right? And not surprisingly, you see a lot of metavolcanic stone in the cold site. Do not guess where that stone came from, right? I know right at the river, right in the Warren Mountains. Two other early archaic sites I want to mention, the works sites I've been down in the Coast Plain, Squires Ridge and Marble Creek along the Tar River. So the early archaic is a diagnostic of side and corner notch points, right? And you can pretty easily see the transition from the Hardaway dome to the Hardaway side notch. This would be equivalent to Taylor points here in South Carolina, and then moves into Kurt Palmer and Kurt corner notch points, and then a hard point, and then the tail end of the early archaic would be bifurcated base points. So these are all the signatures when you're out digging a site. How do you know when you hit your archaic? These are the signposts that you need to find. So along the Tar River, the northern coastal plain, when I arrived in East Carolina 25 years ago, we didn't know much about the archaic of the coastal plain, but I knew something about the archaic from the Piedmont, so I wanted to look for some archaic sites along in the eastern part of the state. That brought me to the Tar River, where Chris Moore, Chris Moore, began to work. I worked with him. We did an archaeological survey along the Tar River. The Tar River is the main drainage in the eastern part of the state. And we did our survey in Pitt and Edgerton counties, about 25 miles. And this is a result of sort of Chris's work. This is, again, a LiDAR image. Think of an aerial photograph. LiDAR stands for light and ranging. What LiDAR does is a great job of showing changes in elevation with millimeter level of accuracy. Right? And so what you're looking at here is high level, the white here, right there, and then the mostly you see reddish brown, that sort of high level, higher elevation. You can't get too high, right? But for the coastal plain, this is the high points. And this is the Tar River, right? The blue. And what you're looking at is the floodplain of the Tar River. What's interesting is that, of course, the Tar River, the channel you see today didn't always exist like that. All the major rivers along the South Atlantic coastal plain, the Tar, the Cape Fear, the Neuse, down to the Savannah River, existed in a braid plain. They weren't these single-incised channels that you see today. The braid plain, these single-incised channels started forming roughly 16,000 years ago. And you see that simultaneously in all these rivers along the coastal plain. The evidence of that can be seen in this LiDAR image. On a computer screen, they come out a little bit better. from here you can see these kind of little scrolls, these little incised lines in here. Those are ancient grave plains, ancient channels. Right? Think of a delta, right? The Mississippi River Delta, all those spaghetti-like little channels. That's what the Tar River was like 16,000, prior to 16,000 years ago. That was what the Savannah River was like 16,000 years ago. And with the arrival of modern climatic conditions, the sea level approaching modern conditions, in the ice age sea level was much, much lower than today. What's now continental shelf underwater was coastal plain back then. And so with the melting of the glaciers, rising of the sea level, modern climatic conditions, it created changes to the river systems. And the move from these raised plains to these incised channels took place. And so what Chris did, based upon some excavation he did at Barber Creek, this is a sand ridge, right, in Barber Creek. This was a recorded site that UCU did some work on back in the 70s, where a few test pits were done. I did my homework when I arrived at UCU and found that this one site had deposits that went down almost 3 feet, and there was some archaic stuff down in this sand ridge. So I said, well, let's go out there and do some more testing. And we did that, and we found some good stratigraphic sequence. I'll show you a map of that in a minute. But what I then thought about then, well, we got to place Barber Creek in a big context, right? And that context required an archaeological survey, right? In that survey, what Chris did using Barber Creek is kind of a framework, a benchmark. He sat there at the computer screen and using LiDAR, looked for these other sand ridges all up and down the Tar River. That's what these dots and blocks represent. These locations of these sand ridges. About 19 of those. He went out and tested these. Not all of these had good archaeology, but there was a few that did, including Barber Creek and Squires Ridge. A few of these others had some good archaeology in them. And these proved to be quite productive in terms of finding these stratigraphic sequences. So there's this maximum in archaeology to find old sites, you have to find old dirt. We got some old dirt along the Tar River. So these sand ridges, this is a schematic that shows these sand ridges that go from the southwest to northeast across here. And the vertical scale has been exaggerated, but look at these caps here are sand ridges that are a result of windblown sand. Chris did the grain size GOR on these, and most of this is aeolian. That's a big word that means windblown, right? There's some alluvial, that's flood deposits. I'm going to give you, take notes, I'm going to give you a quiz, a vocabulary quiz when I'm done here, right? So there's windblown sand and some flood deposits. But the important point is there are all these sort of these capped, the high points here. And these are dates. We have OSL and radiocarbon dates. So for example, 16.8 plus or minus 1.9 thousand years ago. That's the base here. That marks sort of the beginning of the formation of these sand ridges that go up to 5,000 or 6,000 years of age. These ridges stopped forming probably sometime around 3,000 years ago. These are relic sand dunes, right? Relic, they're no longer active. But they are giant sand time capsules, right? In terms of the presence of the earliest people in the coastal plain. So this is sort of a profile here. Again, some of Chris's work. These are some of these dates, 14.5,000, 10.6 thousand point types. And we have, the good thing here is that the sand's going in intermittently for thousands of years. People are coming out on these sand ridges, working or living and trying to figure exactly the function of these. But that windblown sand is active to preserve and stack these occupations up in a cake-like fashion, right? So we've got these early archaic floors here. This is roughly 10,000, 99, 10,2, 5,500. This is a rock cluster, probably in the heart. And then early woodland, like very late archaic pottery in the upper levels, right? So we've got a pretty good stratigraphic sequence here. Barber Creek and Squires Ridge. This is a trench right here. You can see the sand. It's hard to see any kind of stratigraphic change here. That's why you have to do the grain size analysis. That's why you have to piece plus artifacts. There's Chris. There's more here. He was sort of like graduate assistant during a lot of his time. And so this requires some a back plot where you get the kind of three-dimensional coordinates of these artifacts. And so by doing this, you can see these three zones. And so I know this looks like a hot mess, but when you look at it, you can see this is early Archaic, middle Archaic, late Archaic, early Woodland. So it's stacked up in pretty good stratigraphic fashion. What's interesting is that this little cluster here, you can see students working here, this is a 1 meter square. And there's a bunch of artifacts that will refit here. We refit portions of three columns. We laid all this out, right, on the table. Had students, I said, this is your jigsaw puzzle, right? And so you get extra credit, right, if you can refit these. And that it motivates a lot of students, right? And so what's interesting here in this 1 meter, 3 foot square, 1 meter, roughly 3 foot, we have portions of three cobbles that we refit. You can see this cobble here, right? And portions, this is top, side, bottom view of other, and they're all here. That's what these lines represent, where these refit. And so these cobbles aren't very big, they're about that big. And so what would they do? Well, this is the stone you get in the coastal plain. You're not going to get good sherb or rhyolite. So there was one of the functions of the site is going down the river. It's just a stone's throw. It doesn't come intended, right, from the site, right? They're going down the Ohio River, grabbing these cobbles and beating them bipolar. We're using sort of, we get these sort of tabular pieces of stone, and then reducing them, getting raw material to make some probably flake cutting tools. So what were they doing there? Well, you got to, we're digging some trenches to sort of get the chronological sequence. We also did some broad scale, what we call shovel testing. That's digging these relatively small holes at regular intervals, around 30-meter intervals. We peppered these ridges. These ridges go for a couple hundred meters. So this is a topographic map. This is Squires Ridge. This is Barber Creek, right? And every one of these dots represents a shovel test, unlike what you see here. And then we collected the artifacts and just basic artifact frequency counts. And what's interesting here is the frequency distribution of artifacts across the ridge. And there's a similar pattern here. So you get these high frequencies here, these bullseye stuff, around 10 to 20 meters in diameter, one here, one here, one here, one here, one here. And they're placed at roughly equal intervals right along the ridge here. And the same pattern, although it's a little more curvilinear here at Barber Creek. There's one here, 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 and here. Right? So what do these represent? Well, these could be sort of family activity areas, right? People were living. They could be specialized work areas. We've got to really some more analysis. We've got to dig a big block here and really get a 20-meter block and really piece by piece to figure this out. But this is sort of the point is we have some good early archaic material. We've got some sites with stratigraphic sequence. And they're not unlike what you have here down the Pee Dee River, right, Clovis site. And so this is again sort of these sandy ridges, and you've got these dates 12 to 11, right, and you've got these early archaic points here, a Kirk point, these piece plot here, there's a Kirk corner notch point, these other unification tools. There's similar kind of floors, I think, that can be documented, right? This is where the real careful explanation done, right, to really get a handle on what these people were doing in the early Archaic. All right, last thing, the methodological advances that are taking place in archaeology is phenomenal. Right? Perhaps the best example of this is ancient DNA. Right? Getting DNA from bones. Getting DNA from dirt, getting Neanderthal DNA from caves in Europe, right? Who'd have thought that, right? Well, you can get DNA from dirt, you can get blood from the stone. And that's what Chris Moore has done. Looking at Clovis and early archaic points, protein residue analysis, right? That's another vocabulary term for you, right? This is CSI stuff, right? This is CSI stuff. This has been used in forensic science for a couple of decades. We're now using it in archaeology. This is cutting edge stuff. It's still relatively new. And what Chris has done is looked at some Clovis points, some early archaic points here in South Carolina, and published this in American Antiquities, Superior Journal, right, in our discipline. And he's found evidence of a variety of blood residue that represents a variety of animals. Now, the work here, you can't get exactly down to species, and some of them you can only get to family levels, and so two patterns here are interesting, right? One is that in looking at the Clovis points, there's no extinct megafauna, right? They tested for elephant, right? And you're using elephant serum, right? We don't have any mammoths walking around that you get blood serum on, but contemporary elephants, and so there's no Pleistocene megafauna present in the Clovis points. Rather, you get sort of more contemporary fauna. But one thing that stands out is the presence of bison. Bovine. Presumably that's some extinct form of bison. But what's really interesting is this bison residue, blood residue, extends into the Middle Archaic. There's Guilford points with bovine blood residue. Now, that's a head scratcher right now. Maybe this is a false positive. I mean, this is all kind of new stuff. But maybe it's real, right? Maybe bison lived in the Middle Holocene, right? And the eastern woodland bison lived much longer than we thought, right? These are cousins of the bison that were more commonly associated with Great Plains, right? They were claimed by the Plains Indians. So, in any case, this is where the future of archaeology lies in these interesting new techniques. I'm going to tell you, it's not too long before you get DNA right here in the Carolinas, right? There's some ancient DNA waiting to be found here in the Carolinas. All right, so to sum up, right, the Carolinas have their story to tell. Looking at sort of statewide distribution of points is important. The Pasquotine site is our only real good Clovis assemblage, and it's a benchmark for studying the Clovis toolkit. Private collections have scientific value, right? I'm a big advocate of working with collectors. You're not going to find 275 Clovis points in a museum anywhere, right? Where you get those when you got to work with collectors. Right? And so you have to trust each other enough to recognize if you want to make a contribution, if you want to have a legacy here, you know, this is the kind of collaboration that will do that, right? Stratified sites are present here in the coastal plain of North and South Carolina, right? We're going to find that Clovis site at some point, right? Well, we just need more digging to do that. But now we know where to go to dig. It's like a needle in a haystack, right? But to find that needle, you got to be in the right haystack first, right? Before you find the needle. That haystack with these relic sand dunes that are widespread up and down the coastal plains. And then the advances in geoarchaeology to pinpoint these places, these immunological studies, blood residue, and I should put up there ancient DNA. It's only a matter of time. This is where I predict some of the greatest breakthroughs in archaeology will come. All right, so while some people end their shows with sunsets, I end mine with cruise shots. So I appreciate your time. I spoke exactly an hour, a little bit longer than I wanted to, but I get wound up when I talk like this, right? And so if you're my students, you got up and left Dr. Daniel, this class is over. Right? So anyway, I'll be glad to entertain any questions you might have.